You're listening to The Agronomy Show, presented by Advanced Agrilytics.
Well, hello, listeners. Travis Martin here, back with The Agronomy Show. This week, we're going to continue the Fast 5-Minute series, where you hear from one of our precision agronomists for a quick 5-minute crop update and question series. This week, we are in Indiana with Joe.virgin. We recorded this episode with Joe on Wednesday, September 9th. So today we have Joe.virgin joining us from Indiana. Joe, to kick us off, why don't you give listeners an idea of where you're located, the geography you cover, and then a brief crop update here as we record this on September 9th.
Good morning, and thank you, Travis, for having me on this call. As Travis mentioned, I cover the west central side of Indiana, approximately 45 miles northwest of Indianapolis, and we cover along that western side of the state, bordering over to Illinois. So what we are seeing now are current crop conditions. We ended up being a little bit dry here for the last half of August with very little rainfall, so that has sped up crop maturity progress. What we're currently seeing in the corn crop as we approach black layer, also known as full maturity, within the next 3 to 7 days. A lot of this fuller season corn that got planted in the middle of April will reach black layer, and typically that is a 30 to 35% harvest moisture at black layer. With these warm temperatures in the 80s and drier air conditions, we're going to see some pretty rapid field dry down. Typically, you'll see 0.4 of a point to up to 1 point per day dry down. And with that in mind, we're going to see combines starting to roll within the next 7 days as guys feel like it's time to head into harvest mode.
The first theme we want to hit on today, Joe, is how we're looking at corn stalk quality and then grain moisture. As you're walking through fields, what conditions are you looking for right now, and how are you assessing those as you think about harvest?
A good question, Travis. We really start looking at stalk quality early in the season when we go through pollination and grain fill, as we determine the amount of nitrogen we pulled into that stalk to build that big factory. And so that assessment really starts early on in that time frame. And as we get closer to maturity here, as corn starts to senesce, reallocation of that energy to put everything into that ear, we can run into issues with weakened stalk quality, which could be caused by several factors. It could just be a hybrid trait of that characteristic of that corn, that it puts everything into that ear. You might say it all, because it's done its part. It's produced that ear with the offspring, if you will. The other factors we get into is if we had a lot of foliar diseases early in the season, which once again just slowed down carbohydrate intake into that plant. Foliar diseases, we get into some stalk diseases. And one thing we often overlook, Travis, is early on in planting season, if that corn lays in a cool, wet environment, like we saw some areas, we can bring in the onset of fusarium root and crown rot early on. And it's often easy to forget about that. That corn plant might look pretty normal throughout the growing season, but then that tends to cause an infection into that plant that'll start showing up at harvest time. So as I mentioned earlier, we're approaching harvest here pretty soon, and I always try to encourage guys with their current drying systems and LP relatively cheap this year. The risk reward of going out and harvesting corn, let's say starting at 25% harvest moisture, we tend to save a lot of more grain versus waiting for corn to dry down to that 18-20%. And I kind of liken it to a bird in the hand's better than two in the bush. I'd rather shell some 25% corn while I know I have good weather conditions. We never know what the forecast is going to hold as we get into mid-late harvest. Threats of wind, threats of saturated field conditions. So I tend to go on the aggressive side, and man, if your system's ready to roll, your drying system's up and go, I like to encourage guys, let's get this harvest underway as quick as we can.
So finally, Joe, let's touch a bit on farm safety. We're coming into a busy time of year, as you just mentioned. Sounds like we're about 7 days out to people start to roll. So what protocols, rules, procedures should folks be thinking about as we come into the fall?
Thank you, Travis, for giving me the opportunity to discuss this. I know this is a little bit different than our normal agronomic talks, but when you sum it up, everything we do to produce a crop, making sure the family farm or your farm business stays viable, what's the really bottom line here? And that's personal safety and our well-being at the end of every day. Some might think I'm a little bit off when I say I have a passion for safety and trying to follow the best safety practices. In my former role as a grain division safety manager for a local cooperative, we learned that safety is it's not to be treated as a club or a threat to be safe, to keep your job, but it's about buy-in and creating that environment to where it's a caring environment. We care about everybody's well-being, and we want to make sure everybody goes home safe at the end of the day. No different with a grain elevator as it is in our farming operations, because the size of these operations anymore are huge. And so I really feel it's so valuable to take 15 to 20 minutes at the minimum to sit down with your harvest crew at the onset of safety. Let's go through some protocols. And I would challenge everybody to sit down every day in the morning and say, we not only have a goal of how many acres we're going to get harvested, how many bushels we're going to bring in, how many truckloads of grain we're going to haul, but in all sincerity, the first goal should be that we discuss is we want everybody to go home the way they showed up, intact with no injuries. This could be a very long conversation, but let me highlight on a few things, Travis. Number one, the operator must be aware of their surroundings as well as what I call the people on the ground. That's the people around this equipment, and be aware of presence at all time. No different than when we're with semis setting out in the field, a lot of moving traffic going on. So just first thing is that total awareness. Secondly, is we visit about grain facilities. We all know the inherent danger, and unfortunately we hear about tragedies every fall. People entering into grain bins and accidentally being pulled down. Such simple precautions can be taken. For example, what we used to call lockout tagout, and that's making sure these disconnect or withdrawal augers are in the off position, and a very inexpensive padlock from a local hardware store to lock that switch box so nobody can accidentally go over there, wonder why that's turned off, engage that, which we know the result can be. We need to keep in mind that all these grain facilities anymore are fully automated. So obviously augers kick on anytime unexpectedly. Once again, if we're going to do service on those, I would advocate that lockout tag out again. Pull that disconnect, kill the switches in the control panel, and put a padlock on there. A 30 to 60 second precaution can sure save a lot of regret later on down the road. We also need to keep in mind that these grain facilities, the control rooms are very remote from a lot of these augers. So we need to be aware of that before we try to grab a belt, see if it needs to be tightened and work on it. So it's a very simple task. I don't want it to seem like it's a chore, but more so it's a reward at the end of the day. One thing we get caught up in, Travis, is we say safety is nothing more than common sense. Well, that is correct, but we never want to assume that everybody has that same level of common sense through former experiences. So that's why it's so important that we sit down at the onset of harvest. I would encourage develop a one-pager. Here's some of our protocols that we need to put in place and discuss those every day. If we have what we call a near miss, which is one of those deals where you say, I got lucky on that one and that could have been a lot worse. I don't think we want to be ashamed of that, but I think we need to bring that up and share that with the other teammates that we're working with, just as an experience. That helps develop that so-called level of common sense. So we make sure it doesn't happen again. And the last thing I'll say is that if you're aware of the inherent risk before you dive into a piece of equipment or start to work on something, but you feel like you're exempt from being damaged by that action, then you need to rethink again, because we don't want to count on just hoping we get lucky when we take those unnecessary risks when it comes to safety. So Travis, like I said, I could really go into a lot of detail, but I know for the sake of time, it's just more about creating that cultural environment, letting everyone know that we need to be safe and have that type of attitude. Safety should not be viewed as a chore, but as a reward to feeling good about the way we operate, and we're concerned about everybody's well-being.
Thanks to Joe for that safety update. If our listeners have more specific safety questions, Joe wanted to make sure his contact information was available, so you can find that in the show notes if you'd want to follow up. With that, we will sign off for today. Everyone stay safe and have an awesome week.
Thanks for tuning in to the Agronomy Show podcast. For more information on the Agronomy Show and Advanced Agrilytics, head to advancedagrilytics.com.